So I want to welcome you all to the Fleming tonight. I'm Janie Cohen, I'm director of the museum, and we are thrilled to see you all here. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, great. I want to just start with a few thank yous and very brief introductions for our panel. I want to begin by thanking Anthony Grudin for organizing this. It is a really terrific opportunity, and I'm especially excited to welcome the students here because it's just it's a great chance to hear what will be a very informed and I think lively conversation about one of the most important artists working today anywhere. Briefly, we have two of our esteemed colleagues here, but I want to start with our special guest, Christina Sharpe, and we are thrilled to have her with us from Tufts. Tufts University. She has a book that has just come out that I have here, Monstrous Intimacies, Making Post-Slavery Subjects. And this is, excuse me one sec, this focuses on the subject of her work for many years. Prior to arriving at Tufts in '98, she was assistant professor of English at Hobart and William Smith colleges. Her work was supported with the Ford Foundation postdoc fellowship, and she received support from Tufts for the manuscript of the book that is now out and was published in 2010. She focuses her research on Black cultural studies and particularly the visual arts, African and American diaspora, Carol Walker, Robert Colescott, Isaac Julian, Tracy Rose, and others, as well as 19th and 20th century African American literature and culture. We are really delighted to have her and our two UVM contributors to the panel, Anthony, who's going to be moderating it. Anthony is assistant professor at UVM, where he started in 2009, freshly minted with a PhD from UC Berkeley, and wrote his dissertation on Warhol and has been publishing and is about to come out with a book that is based on his dissertation. Am I correct about that? And John Gennari, associate professor of English at UVM, who's been a core faculty member in UVM's critical race and ethnic studies program, and did his PhD from BA from Harvard, and MA and PhD from University of Pennsylvania, studying American civilization. So please join me in welcoming Christina, Anthony, and John. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janie, and thanks everybody for coming. This is just a wonderful turnout. I'm going to get right to it. Each of us will speak for just under 10 minutes, give a couple introductory remarks, and then we'll open the floor for questions and comments. So I will probably be the most introductory of the three of us because this is probably farthest afield for me, but I think I have some helpful things to say about Walker. The more I thought about Walker this month, the more it struck me that she is one of a select group of artists working today whose work will remain interesting and relevant as long as there is anyone alive who cares about the sad and strange history of the United States of America. She is, in other words, a powerfully political artist. She is our Goya, our Courbet. When historians 300 years from now want to understand the true weirdness and hypocrisy of culture in the United States, they will turn to Walker's work for answers. The fact that her work has proven so profoundly offensive to so many right-minded people only testifies to this achievement. Our racial life world in the United States is profoundly offensive. Any work that tries to describe this life world without acknowledging this reality has already missed its appointment. So that's point one. Point two. Second, it's important to recognize that one of the sources of the political power of Walker's work is her ability to incorporate and extend the psychoanalytic insights developed in the first half of the 20th century by surrealism. She understands, and her work demonstrates, that political strife, in a second, in the United States has a powerful unconscious dimension, that we each live, to quote Frederick Jameson, with a political unconscious that refuses to recognize the laws of science or logic. A few hours with MTV or Sports Center will make this point irrefutable. The powerful fascination that can simultaneously crave Miley Cyrus's dancers and Kevin Durant's mom cannot be explained logically. There are times, Walker told an interviewer in 1998, when you're friends with somebody or you're having a relationship and you're not thinking about race for a brief moment. Then suddenly the entire history of the whole United States of America or the American South or post-Reconstruction comes crashing down on you and you say to yourself, this reminds me of something. I'm not sure what it is, but it's vaguely familiar. Walker's work is a remarkably brave effort to explore the strange dynamics of the American political unconscious, and particularly its vexed relationship to slavery, the terrible cocktail of guilt and resentment and desire and violence that still permeates white and black race relations in the United States, and, quote, to externalize what can't be processed internally, as Walker puts it. Finally, and here I hope I'll be preparing the stage for the remarks of my esteemed colleagues, Christina and John, Walker's investigations of the American political unconscious are even more remarkable for the way they attempt to express this political unconscious formally. As Freud never tired of reminding us, and as some of the surrealists recognize, the unconscious's fundamental power is distortional. It condenses and displaces, and it makes the familiar terrifying and the terrifying familiar. But it's one thing for someone like me, or even Walker, to talk about the paradoxes of the political unconscious abstractly and logically. It's quite another and more remarkable achievement for someone to make these paradoxical dynamics visible. That's what Walker's trademark silhouette style does. It visualizes the unconscious ideologies of race. It gives them form. The truth of the piece, Walker tells us, is as clear as a Rorschach test. With the remarkable efficiency of the rabbit duck, Walker's silhouettes show us that while stereotypes appear to inhere naturally in their objects, the black forms themselves, they are in fact historically and culturally produced and can only appear through their juxtaposition with their surroundings. What's more, although we tend to focus on the stereotype as a distorted and fascinating figure, that leaves us seeing only half the picture. As Christina Sharpe's work on Walker has brilliantly demonstrated, the white negative space is just as distorted by the action of stereotyping as the black positive space is. The fact that viewers of all backgrounds have tended to focus on the black figures and their supposedly inherent deformities, rather than the massive and dominating white spaces and their framing distortions, speaks volumes about habits of looking and thinking. One last quick note, I do have available for us today all 15 of the images in the Harper series, and I have most of the source images from the Harper's book. So during the course of our conversations, if anybody would like to call any of those up, we can put them up on the board. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm actually going to pause this there. Thank you, Anthony, and all of you for coming out. It's been a long time since I've been part of a panel discussion where people have actually showed up. Contra what Anthony said, I think I'm the outlier here because I don't work in art history. I'm a fraudulent professor of English. My background being in American studies, and I have come to Kara Walker through a couple different avenues, but most recently. I write about jazz, among other things, and I recently wrote a lecture about the contemporary jazz pianist Jason Moran, and it's about Jason Moran's multimedia performance work, quite quite unusually for a jazz musician, particularly a jazz musician who does a lot of work in sort of common practice situations as a leader and sideman and composer and such. He's carved out this other career doing collaborative work with performance artists in museums largely. And I wanted to think about what that meant for jazz and for museums, and it got me interested in jazz in relation to performance, more generally the history of performance, performance in the sense of the history of theater, that kind of performance, but also performance art. One of his collaborators in that in that space has been Kara Walker, and what I'll show you in a minute is a brief glimpse of her participation in a piece that Jason Moran and his wife, the mezzo-soprano vocalist Alicia Hall Moran, curated for the 2012 Whitney Biennial called Bleed. Bleed, an interesting title, I think, capturing both the sense of a bleeding together of art forms and aesthetic practices, but also the theme of blood in African-American history, a soaked in blood history, but also blood as in familial kin. Lots of different ways to think about that. And I guess where I want to come around to in my short time here is my way of thinking about Kara Walker in the kind of object-based visual pieces in museums, not her performance pieces, nevertheless, interestingly viewed through a performance and performance studies lens for a couple of reasons. One of them being that the subject matter of this exhibition, a lot of her work, is the Civil War era, and this is the time of blackface minstrelsy, which is the dominant performance tradition in American history, which continues to shape American popular culture down to our own time. So what I'm going to suggest is that Kara Walker, along with Jason Moran and some other people who, not incidentally, are talked about as being key members of what's been called the New Harlem Renaissance, or the Renaissance of the Harlem Renaissance, for the kind of intense creative ferment that's taking place in Harlem all across the arts. And that is interesting in a number of respects, and one of them is the kind of multimedia engagements that these artists are making with each other, and not just artists. The Bleed exhibition at the Whitney included scholars and writers and even a celebrity chef and an acupuncturist. But let's look at this. Now, what you're going to see at the beginning is a snippet that'll just give you a feel for the performance art and multimedia nature of this. And then I'm going to skip ahead to a section where all of a sudden you're going to see Kara Walker in the persona of performance artist Karaoke Walker singing very briefly the Rolling Stones' Brown Sugar, backed by Jason Moran's trio.
The barriers, breaking out of misunderstanding, breaking out of the art world, breaking out of the society, breaking out
Here's my inelegant skip ahead. Okay, so if I just read a paragraph from that lecture. Performance, I'll explain that in a second, is both a complicated and a clarifying term in jazz, owing to its affiliation with histories of racialized and gendered practice and ideology. Jazz is shadowed not just by minstrelsy and what Paige McGinley, a performance studies scholar, calls minstrelsy's vicious hangover, but more deeply by the history of the black body and its centrality to both the suffering and the trauma undergirding American capitalism and the joy and pleasure generated by American entertainment. Saidiya Hartman argues that the compulsory performances demanded of enslaved persons, the coffle, the coerced gaiety at the slave market, the spectacle of bodies on the auction block, constituted a form of public theater, dramatizing the racial logic of the U.S. social order. United in that logic are minstrelsy's trope of the singing and dancing slave, and what jazz musician Anthony Braxton calls the reality of the sweating brow, that is, the exercise of white power through consumption of an enforced, performed happiness in which signs of the black performing subject's willing labor must be manifest. This history also saturates the creative imagination of artist Kara Walker. Her most recent work was an in situ installation featuring an enormous sculpture of a black woman working in a sugarcane field, crouched in a position of acute sexual vulnerability, yet at the same time full of the self-possession and sovereign repose of a Buddhist icon or a monumental Egyptian sphinx. The sculpture, called A Subtlety or the Marvelous Sugar Baby, was made out of 30 tons of refined white sugar molded on to vast blocks of polystyrene foam. Heralded by the New York Times as one of the most substantial works of art to hit New York in years, it sat in the cavernous sugar shed of the old Domino factory in Brooklyn, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors this past summer. The installation serves as a kind of diptych with the piece Walker performed with Jason Moran at the Bleed exhibition at the 2012 Whitney Biennial. That exhibition, I have an argument in here about how Bleed is a kind of postmodern minstrel show in its multimedia form, and in part of it that I didn't show, where it really, in a Walker-like way, takes on some of the figures of minstrelsy. On that occasion, Walker was a performance artist using the stage name Karaoke Walker, singing in a willfully grating voice to Moran's band's gloss on the Stones' Brown Sugar, while her laptop projected blow-ups of words like crawl, beg, grovel, slit, blood, and others, connecting Mick Jagger's libido to the history of sugar, plantation slavery, and the subjection of the black female body. So, Kara is just such a fascinating artist, and I think that the performance side of her oeuvre is probably less known than what most of you are familiar with. And it seems to me that this represents a really important kind of moment in the history of performance art. Performance artists in general are not performers, writes the artist and curator Helene Lesterlin. How much time do I have?
Well, a little tight. Like
a minute.
A minute. Good.
I'll be direct.
They're engaging in a visual arts-based practice that hinges on the idea that their body and the body of others is their material. Now, performance art and conceptual art emerged as an almost exclusively white avant-garde movement in the 60s and 70s. There's been a renaissance of these fields in recent years that's been driven, I think, by black artists like Homer Jackson, Clifford Owens, and Xavier Simmons, building on the work of pioneer forebears like Sherman Fleming and Adrian Piper. And this makes sense to me. Since so much of American performance in the theatrical sense owes its origins to blackface minstrelsy, and so much American performance in the Irving Goffman presentation of self in everyday life sense has to do with the negotiation of racial codes. Performance art's ironic, trenchantly knowing stance toward performance per se, its self-reflexive commentary on the ways bodies perform in public, compel it to engage forthrightly with race. And so, for time reasons, just to try to connect this to the pieces in this exhibition, I think if we look at those pieces and some of her earlier work with the antebellum slavery and Civil War era thematics, if we think of them as if we look at them through a performance lens and think about the figures as performing certain kinds of codes that have to do with race, that have to do with gender, etc., I think it opens up some new ways of thinking about what she's up to. I'll leave it there, and there'll be, I think, more to say about that when we engage in a dialogue.
Your computer?
Yeah, so that you can have it in front of you.
So last, thank you both for your comments and for your wonderful introduction that led us. There's some really interesting connections which we could not have known ahead of time. So I'm a prolific tweeter, for those of you who are on Twitter, a not so prolific Tumblrer, but do you see brown sugar? So on my Tumblr, I don't know if you know the words for brown sugar, so I'll just leave them up for a minute. When I was a teen, I went to see the Rolling Stones in a concert in Philadelphia, and I really didn't know what the words were, except a young woman came up to me and called me brown sugar, and I was a little upset about that. But now that I know the words, it's even more interesting, so I'll leave those up for a minute, and then I'll go to something that's actually more central to the talk. So I have 3 brief sections on Carol Walker's work, and each one starts with an epigraph. The first epigraph is from Frank Wilderson, and it's, quote, "Blacks are so comprehensively fungible that cinema," and in the place of cinema, I'll insert visual arts, that visual arts can make them die and smile at the same time. So in my first book, Monstrous Intimacies, Making Post-Slavery Subjects, the final chapter was on Carol Walker's work, and it was called simply Carol Walker's Monstrous Intimacies. I began that chapter with the subheading Look and See, which in this moment I want to note speaks to the attempts of the victim of and witness to horrors attempt to convey the fullness of that horror to a reader or a viewer. It's borrowed from numerous slave narratives that I teach, as well as from Charlotte Delbo's trilogy Auschwitz and After. Each of the narratives that I've just mentioned, I think, that issue that command, issue it in relation to the impossibility of that transfer of looking and seeing from survivor of horror to horror's possible spectator or witness. So there's something that we recognize as it's impossible in the command to look and see. I wrote, "To see the black silhouettes of the African-American visual artist Carol Walker in a gallery installation is to be caught up in the scenes and therefore in the actions of the figures that populate them. Walker's scenes of profound, excessive, sexualized violence incorporate all of her viewers and produce a number of anxious, often hysterical responses from some of her critics, both those who applaud her work and those for whom it is regressive minstrelsy. Each of her primarily white critics that I read reading Walker has specific blind spots that appear to me to be symptomatic of the ways that American post-slavery subjectivity is constituted, conferred, and not acknowledged." I think what you spoke of very powerfully in the beginning as a sort of political bent of her work, that it's all politics in some way. While each viewer or critic proceeds from the awareness that the subjects depicted in the images are both black and white, the subject of the work slavery and Walker's own accompanying explanations make this clear, the black figures in her silhouetted work nonetheless tend to become the sole site on which the signifying power of slavery in the past and the present is put to work. In other words, the majority of critics, readers, and viewers, regardless of their diegetic reading of the work, locate its signifying effect almost exclusively on black people. Such myopia is unsurprising given that the history of slavery and race in the U.S. tends to be regarded as an issue of and for black people, about black people, and involves a persistent erasure of whiteness. I suspect that it was in order to work against that persistent perceptual repression of the whiteness of the diegetically white black figures from her work, and therefore removed them beyond the scope of slavery, that Walker added to some installations in the beginning of 2000s, that she started adding gray backgrounds, and she used light and overhead projection. I think additions that made the viewer, any viewer, and every viewer's interpolation by the scene much more difficult to disavow. To enter that gallery space was to enter into the exhibit, to step in front of the projector, to always be included, to appear as one of the shadows on the wall, the scene that now includes the viewer. Walker's silhouetted tableaux come to life through their abstraction to a pure black and white form. So I was interested then, as I am now, in the ways that many white viewers of Walker's work, but not only white viewers, erased themselves from the work both visually and historically. And I continue to be interested in that disavowal or absenting, both in the responses to the work that's on display here and in relation to the work that I'll mention next, her first sculpture and public art project. In other words, I remain interested in the spectacle of the work and how that work works in various sites and on various audiences and viewers, and then again on those viewers as they view each other viewing. So I'm interested in the multiplied gazes and interactions to what is, in my mind, really quite visceral work. So part 2, a subtlety, violence in the production of relation. Carol Walker says, quote, about a subtlety, "This is like a gift. It's not like a history lesson or me excoriating people of the present. Let me start over. This is like a gift. It's not like a history lesson or me excoriating people of the present about the sins of the past. This is like a gift for families on their weekends to come and have both the quality of a thing that's really big, powerful, and uncanny that contains all of these histories I'm interested in, ancient histories and more contemporary histories. It's like a New World Sphinx," end quote. So Walker's large-scale public site-specific commissioned work is called, the full title, A Subtlety, or the Marvelous Sugar Baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet tastes from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino sugar refining plant. In an interview with Complex magazine and citing Sidney Mintz's work on sugar, Walker says, quote, "The medieval fashioning of sugar, called subtleties. He talked about the subtleties as a medieval dish that appeared on the tables of the rich. A subtlety is a political sugar sculpture. They were scenes rendered in sugar paste that the nobility and the guests of the king would recognize as something that had political or religious importance. They were eaten as a dessert or in between meals. There was this beautiful poetic gesture." So I'm interested here in what Walker's talking about in this beautiful political and poetic gesture. I'm interested in who recognizes the significance of the gesture here and to what ends the gesture is made. So in the Domino Factory warehouse, there were 15 5-foot-high sculptures of young boys, the sugar babies, you see them there, carrying the baskets. And over time, they start to melt and decompose, and they fall apart. You're also, even though I did not go to it, and I could talk about that in question and answer, I know that you were assaulted by the smell of the factory as you came in. So they're covered in molasses, and they have fruit baskets of unrefined sugar. And the Sphinx herself was 35 feet high and was sugar-coated white. So Walker says that, quote, "Sugar crystallizes something in our American soul. It's emblematic of all industrial processes and of the idea of becoming white. White being equated with pure and true, it takes a lot of energy to turn brown things into white." And those people who grew up in the Caribbean talk about, brown sugar was what you ate every day, white sugar was for special occasions, and the thousands of bones it took to make the sugar white. So there's this feeling that things just don't go away, and this molasses has been oozing down these walls for 100 years or so. It never dries completely. It stays alive, which makes this space much more potent and magical, end quote. Also here everywhere is the question, or the sort of beingness of brutality, the brutality of production, the brutal production of relations between the enslaved and the overseer, plantation owner, sugar consumer, and what Black feminist geographer Catherine McKittrick calls plantation geographies, and what she also calls sort of stretching into the present plantation futures. So on the question of brutality in the Black Jacobins, which some of you may be familiar with, C.L.R. James in the opening pages details some of the everyday brutalities that one could see on sugar plantation. And by everyday, I mean at any point you could see these horrors taking place on any plantation. He says, quote, "The masters poured burning wax on the slaves on the arms and hands and shoulders of the enslaved, emptying the boiling cane sugar over their heads, burned them alive, roasted them on slow fires, filled them with gunpowder and blew them up with a match, buried them up to the neck and smeared their heads with sugar that the flies might devour them, end quote. And you can think of the images in the room and the images where you have, legs blown apart and, heads, sort of other images coming out of a head that's been sort of, evacuated by gunshot or something. So you can really think about that sort of visceral violence. So sugar is punishment, sugar is excess, sugar is pain, sugar is pleasure, and it goes to what you were saying about bleed, the way those things bleed into each other. So we're living in the afterlives of that brutality, and that is not the past. Robert Shelton, who was a former Domino factory employee and a docent for Walker's exhibition, the only former employee who worked as a docent, talked about how difficult the work was, the way it was hard on the body and soul. He also talks about the number that he had to check in, and he says, after 20 years, you never forget that number. He said he recalls, too, that a co-worker who continued to come to the refinery in spite of being diagnosed with terminal liver cancer kept coming in the hopes of enabling his wife to receive the $20,000 death benefit available to families if workers died on the premises. He got his wish, end quote. So when thinking about Walker's idea of the sculpture as a gift, I also wanted to think a little bit about Marcel Mauss and how the gift works, and the ways that, unlike the sale of a commodity, the giving of a gift, quote, tends to establish a relationship between the parties involved. So what, end quote. So what kinds of relationships are established in the giving and receiving of this gift of the subtlety? And so finally, if we could go to the, I'll talk sort of extemporaneously. That I've been working on, as I said, I'm a prolific tweeter, hysterical blackness on Twitter, hysterical blackness on Tumblr. And so I've been thinking about this project called Thinking Juxtapositionally. And so I've been, that's sort of how I think, juxtapositionally, laterally. It makes sense to me, and hopefully over time it makes sense to people who read my work and my students. So I was thinking about these sort of two spectacles, right? You talked about the New York Times saying that it's one of the biggest spectacles, the biggest art things in New York in a while, and I was thinking about these two big spectacular moments. Marina Abramovic's The Artist is Present, and then Kara Walker's A Subtlety. And so I'll just end with this. So you stand in line for hours to have the chance to sit across from Marina Abramovic. I really wanted to go to that too. I wasn't able to. And you weep, right? You stand in line for hours to see Kara Walker's A Subtlety or The Marvelous Sugar Baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet tastes, from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World, on the occasion of the demolition of the sugar refining plant. You wait to enter the soon-to-be demolished Domino Sugar Refinery, this place that links you to sugar's pleasures and histories and presence of slavery, coolie labor, colonialism, imperialism, death, and displacement, and you cut up. So you can see the actor, who I can't remember his name now, and he's crying, right? But then you have people doing these sort of obscene gestures of touching the genitalia or pinching the nipples of the Kara Walker, and the sort of complete evacuation of the history and presence of the brutality of sugar refinement, instead of the sort of face-to-face with the artist who makes you sort of feel all of these things. And I wanted to think about, why this difference. So I'll end with that.
We're ready for you.
And we still have 20 minutes at least.
Yeah.
I have a comment. I wonder, listening, you were excellent in your presentation, but then if we were to go back into the 19th century, we have other sort of industries which really are equally powerful. I wonder, for instance, if we were sitting perhaps in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania this evening, and we had the room full of former steel workers or former coal miners, would we have this sort of obsessive angst? Or I just was kind of overwhelmed by your comments there. Or a Vermont farmer in the 19th century, the 18th century, when his crops, he has a freeze in June, what are they going to live on for the rest of the year? Or he has tuberculosis in his herd. I just think perhaps, I wonder if we're just overemphasizing or dwelling too much on, if you will, i.e., I know the hideousness, of course, of Caribbean sugarcane in the American South, but I just wonder if we are taken to the extremes this evening of the three comments which both of the panelists have made, and we were to transcend this or to superimpose it on other American, the lumber industry, just think of the accidents in the forests in the 18th and 19th and 20th century, even today in forestry, very difficult industry. If we were to take other industries or other groups of people, or other immigrants, indentured servants, for instance, who came over in the 17th century, 18th century, who lived hard lives as well. The immigrations from the 1840s on, the great Irish, French, Italian, German, Jewish, the hideousness their lives were too. Are we being very insular here this evening? That's my question, both in work habits and in isolation from the existing communities. I just find it a little, a little overwhelming when you compare this to other migrant groups and to other working occupational sort of things. Are we over-dramatizing perhaps the sugarcane versus I had a grandfather, I didn't perhaps, but came from a Vermont farm heritage, but and hearing tales of this growing up, of being kicked by a horse, gored by a bull. You know, they suffered too, and going to school with mutton sandwiches. It's so I just want to put it in perspective a little bit and ask you to broaden the base a little, both occupationally and both, I think, immigrantly, if you will, or racially. I hate using that word.
Well, there's certainly been a lot of pain to go around, and we can only hope that artists will take up these histories that you're talking about and create work that's as poignant as we find this piece. I do think there's something singular about. I think there's something singular about the figure of the black female subject in the way that Walker has captured it, and you know, we could talk for a long time about different traditions of labor and who did the work and how hard the work was. But and again, I can only hope that that all of that will receive its due and bring people together to talk about it. But insofar as we're talking about this, I think that for me anyway, one important kind of difference has to do with the sexual subjugation of black women and the way that it was kind of coterminous with the labor that they were performing in the field, and I think that's what Walker wants us to one of the things that Walker wants us to think about.
I would just say one or two things. I mean, of course, our comments are occasioned. Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. So, of course, our comments are occasioned by the work that we're talking about, right? So, they are in relation to the work and in relation to this artist and what her concerns are. But more than that, I think even some of the language that you used about sort of going to school and taking a mutton sandwich and the language of immigration. African peoples were not immigrants, right? They were captives. And so it was not, and we can talk about all kinds of forces that move people to different places. And, in many ways, there's no such thing as a kind of voluntary immigration because there are all kinds of forces that put people into flow. But there's less voluntary, and that is the space of captivity. There's no problem in talking about race. I mean, race itself is not a problem. It's the sort of detritus and things that mobilize racism that becomes the problem. So when you say you have you shouldn't, I would say don't have difficulty talking about race, but the ways in which race has been used, right? Thinking about education, there's a wonderful, I don't know if any of you saw this, the National Book Awards, I think it was like 2012 or 2013 when Nikki Finney won for her book of poetry called head off and split. It's this amazing speech where she thanks all of the people who have helped her, and she talks about her favorite teacher who saw her at 19 years old sitting on a wall one day and said, you know, Miss Finney, have you read every book in the library? You don't have time to sit here. And she said, you know, she talks about the only thing that she wanted to do was be a poet, and she says, you know, one of the things that one has to remember. And she thanks another professor, Katie, I think it's Katie King, and she says one of the things that she's written about are the ways in which, you know, people of African descent in the United States are the only people for whom it was illegal to be literate. And I think that there are therefore those very different histories. You know, I spoke about Charlotte Delbo, you know, who was interned in death camps for 4.5 years, a member of the French Resistance. So clearly there are ways in which histories come together and break apart, but we have to attend to the specificity of those histories and the ways in which blacks in the U.S. occupy a different position than any other group in terms of being property. So I'll end with that. I don't know if you want to. Okay. I know you had a question.
I just a comment, thinking of Nikki Finney's poetry and Carol Walker's art. And the female body, the black female body. The black female body was also a part of American capitalism.
Precisely.
Because it produced capital.
Yes.
I mean, it gave birth to property, which was not the mother's.
That's right.
And so I think what Finney does in her volumes of poems and what Carol Walker does is to make these powerful comments on American capitalism.
That's right.
And there's some historians are really looking at how American slavery is so important in the creation.
It's the basis of U.S. capital, right? Yes. So the Edward Baptist book that just came out, and you can go back to something like right. What is it? The half that's never been told. You know, Walter Johnson's book. But we can go back to Eric Williams, 1948, Slavery and Capitalism. Right? Absolutely. Sorry.
Right in the middle.
Hi there.
Hi.
I wonder if we could go and go back to the Civil War exhibit that's here and talk. I'd love to hear some comments about what you think in terms of, in the way you just talked about comments on capitalism and the sugar baby. I'd love to hear some commentary on any of these illustrations that are here today as well.
I mean, I could keep talking. I have a comment on everything.
Just use the microphone. Your comments are so great.
I have a comment on everything, as my students will tell you. I'll read a quotation, actually, that I left out, if I can find it. Actually, if you want to say something else.
Go ahead. Take a moment.
It's a quotation from my first book. And as I was walking through, I was thinking about how this sort of specter is everywhere. So it says, a house slave and then a domestic, but not fully domesticated. For the viewer, she, the mammy, is another indicator of desire and its absence, a placeholder, a cipher. With so much projected into and onto her figure, no wonder the mammy becomes large, superabundant, splits into more of herself. Impossible to contain her in one body, impossible not to see her, she circulates widely but remains invisible nonetheless. Having, as Walker says, no place in the memory of her creators as a creation, she becomes a realized figment of collective imagination, an avatar of the collective unconscious, a phantasmatic figure. She is everywhere, every place. And I think that becomes true both in the images on display here and in the Sugar Sphinx. I mean, we can see, I look at this image that Anthony has up now, and it reminds me of an earlier Walker piece. Sorry. It reminds me, and I feel like I'm leaning at a weird angle. It reminds me of an earlier Walker piece from one of her early shows in the 1990s, where there's like a brown paper bag, and there's a foot on the brown paper bag, and it's by itself. And I see this, and I think of the same thing, and I read that brown paper bag or these images as both the sort of the ways in which captives become body parts mobilized on the part of the slave owner, but also I think of it as as indexing other sort of traumatic moments, like the throwing overboard of the 132 living Africans on the slave ship Zong, right? And when the bodies float up, and bodies in water, one of the first things that your I'm tired. What are these things called? Appendages. They're the first things. Your limbs, your they're the first things that separate from the body, and they would float up, right? So if you think of J.M.W. Turner's Slavers throwing overboard, Dead and Dying Typhoon coming on, and you have the fish jumping up and the leg irons and the leg, that sort of indexes that history as well. So I think she has all of these influences in painting, in caricature, etc. So I would think that these sort of, phantasmatic but also sort of massive black figures are that sort of collective unconscious. I mean, people talk about the Civil War without talking about slavery. People talk about states' rights and Southern pride as if that doesn't index slavery. And I think that that's what you see in those images as well.
The only quick thing I'd add to that, I guess two really quick things. First, directly to your point, Walker has said of those prints that once she made those prints, she thought of them as describing the backgrounds of those prints as describing what she had always imagined in the white backgrounds of her other work. Yeah. So in a strange way, those prints are like a key to the other work that we know better, the wall installations with the silhouettes.
The key to Carol Walker's oeuvre.
Yeah. And then to get back to the question of why this particular history of exploitation is so important, that was, for me, why it's still important to look at the aftermath. I think that this history is so important because the stereotypes persist so strongly and with such high levels of fascination, right? I mean, we all want to forget about Miley Cyrus and her dancers, but it captivated the nation for a week when it happened. And then the other side of that with Kevin Durant's mom, where that's the event of the year for sports because of a black athlete singling out his mom as the sacrificer, the real MVP. And again, it captivated the nation. Everybody, at least anybody who happened to catch it on SportsCenter, it was the focal point for at least a few days. So unlike a lot of these other histories of exploitation, these stereotypes remain really, really prominent in contemporary culture.
I don't have too much to add because I must confess I haven't gotten a strong enough take on the pieces that are being exhibited, and I'm not sure that I understand them as a series or any one of them in particular well enough to say anything that's going to be revelatory. But what is interesting is that she's the Harper's images that she's chosen are kind of landscape portraits that are all I think they're all absent of any black bodies in their.
Some of them have.
Do they?
A few, yeah.
Really?
But much less so.
But much less so, yeah.
Okay, so they're not completely absent of those bodies, but she's drawing on kind of the mainstream visual imagery of that moment, and superimposing these images, which are Gothic images, which are minstrel, Piccaninny kinds of images, and in general, you can say about her work that she's making white texts sort of speak a black voice or a black experience. The one that you have up now is the one that intrigues me the most. I wonder if anybody here has a reading of it. Not just here, but out in the audience.
If I would just add one thing, it's also that her work is never just about the past. It's always about the present, right? She talks about mining the past in order to understand the present that we're living in. Readers of the image?
Somebody's right.
Yeah.
Third row.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a read on the image.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay, well, it just occurred to me that this moment in image making was the very last moment before photography took over as how images were widely circulated around the world. And I mean, really literally, Matthew Brady was making photographs of the Civil War at the same time, but they weren't widely circulated because of technologies. So for Carol Walker to be able to make this type of image, which are so powerful, really depends on this last gasp of a truly distorted image. Where, I mean, not that photography isn't distorted, it is, I think we all understand that, but so much of the artist's preconceived notions of what people look like reside in these lithographs that could not happen with photography.
Though in some way it does sort of happen with photography in the beginning, daguerreotypes of, Agassiz and Zeeley's daguerreotypes of the 7 enslaved people in South Carolina, and then the ones he takes of enslaved people in Brazil. It is an attempt to suture those things together so that you have a sense of this is what blackness looks like. Blackness is it's not slavery that's the pathology, it's blackness that's the pathology. So I think you're absolutely right, and that there's again, to come back to that beautiful term, there's a bleed in which one comes to stand in for the other, to take the place of the other, of preconceived notions of what it is to look at blackness and what it is and what blackness indeed looks like.
Image making is always about the image maker.
Yeah, I mean, Frederick Douglass was certainly very aware of that when he says at some point, I only want black daguerreotypists to take my image because I believe that they will see me and take my image and they will not project a vision onto me. Those aren't, that's a...
Jane?
To switch the topic a little bit, so her work obviously has been very controversial, and I think has attracted attracted criticism from various sides and various quarters. So I'm one of those that I'm aware of is an older generation of African American artists like Betty Saar and others who feel that her use of stereotypes and her extension and exaggeration of them and the way she treats them isn't helpful, basically. And I'm just curious, I haven't been privy to that conversation. I've read some, and I'm curious where that discussion stands and how that, if that's kind of still the feeling, or has she responded to that, how that dynamic has played out.
Well, I'll turn it, I just want to make a quick point on that. Walker thinks about it a lot, and one of these images that I put up early, this one on the right, is from a series of drawings and collages that she made kind of trying to think through those questions. What would it be like to make a responsible image of a black person in America? What does that entail? What does it mean to tell the truth? What are the obligations the artist has toward the truth versus not being offensive, not perpetuating stereotypes?
It's been a while since I've written on Walker, and as you said, the book came out 4 years ago, but I do take this on in that book. And I think that, what I try to do is to say that we shouldn't dismiss the older generation of artists' concerns, right? Because they're also talking about this sort of set of looking relations and gallery practice. So I think we can't dismiss them, but Walker has responded to them both in terms of debate and conversation as well as in the sort of art-making practice. Because it's not as if somebody like Betty Saar only produces quote-unquote positive images, neither does somebody like Howardina Pindell. I think it was really about what it means to be an art world darling and how that opens a door for one person and closes the door for others. So I think it was a much more complicated critique of how art circulates and how bodies circulate in those spaces.
And I think one of the brilliant things about what Kara Walker has done that relates to this point is that the image that we had before from the series,
with the two heads.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I guess the point I want to make is that one of the things she's interested in is the history of image making and how it is that the technologies of imaging are themselves part of the history of racial representation. So the silhouette form, of course, it's part of 18th and 19th century society portraiture, but it's also this is the period of physiognomy, phrenology, and this notion of being able to tell character from outward appearance, right? Lavater, is that right? Lavater. Yeah. And it also relates to the notion of stereotype itself. A stereotype, right, is before it was used the way that it's used now, it was from the world of printing, right, and making a print off of a copy rather than an original, right? And so, and I think she's spoken to that, sort of the correspondence between stereotype and silhouette. So I just think she's, I also sympathize with, the previous generation because, all of a sudden she's, she's got a MacArthur and she's getting into the Whitney, and these folks have not had those kinds of opportunities, and it wasn't for them only jealousy.
It was an institutional critique.
It was an institutional critique, and Carl Walker's, she didn't get bogged down in the personal politics of that. And in some of the later work, I think what she's done is gone back and thought about, the mechanics of representation and how that actually plays into the history of race, as it does here.
Yes, Cornelia.
I would say in response to both of the points, Christina, your points, and what you just said about the institution side of it, I'm wondering, I know that I've read that one of the critiques on Walker is that she plays to white expectations, and I'm wondering why that is, why her work made it to the institutions and some of the other work that also had really strong grounding couldn't make it in that way. I'm just intrigued by that construction.
I think some of the criticism implied and sometimes directly stated that the reason that she was more appealing to white audiences was that she had embraced kind of conceptual and appropriationist Duchampian gestures. And so she had crossed over into this traditionally white history of 20th century art, and that was her entree into the museum. And for other artists who were unhappy with that, it seemed to be to them kind of selling out, I think.
I would actually kind of disagree with that,
okay.
Or maybe push back on that in a different way, because I would even disagree that that the sort of 60s, that a certain kind of you're saying Duchampian, but a certain kind of modernist aesthetic is white, right? So you can think about I think Kelly Jones's show that was in New York, and I can't remember his name, the New York Times critic who wrote, I don't understand what these black people are doing with these minimalist forms, etc. Do you know what I'm talking about? Really well-known white male New York Times critic.
Is that Kennedy?
I could bring it up because I have all these things saved, but he sort of pushes back and says, these aren't their forms. I don't know why, this show is purely imitative. And so, but we can go back and we can look at people like Martin Puryear and other people who are doing this work, and they've just been completely marginalized. And I guess that's part of what I see in this image too. The things that have been pushed to the margins in terms that been labeled as vestigial to U.S. history, that are actually central, take center form. And so I think that it's a moment in which there can really only be one, and she was the one, and therefore everything else gets spun and dismissed as jealousy and not valid critique, and not a critique of how the institution chooses the one when the one is the black artist or the Asian American artist or the Native American artist, right? Yeah, but I think that the history, we need to sort of rethink the history that there are, black forms and white forms when there are artists across race doing these things at the same time, but they did not get the institutional backing, they didn't get the galleries, they didn't get the solo shows, etc.
Yes?
I think that there's something really important. I think that kind of goes along with what you were saying, that there's something very deeply personal about Kara Walker's work, but also something that is so extreme that it allows kind of a separation from the personal. So there's this kind of struggle between what you're seeing and connecting it to real people, and then it's just so magnified and monstrous to what people normally would imagine that it gets separated from it. And it's kind of, I don't know, do you see that in her work or in the critique of it?
Sure, yeah.
Well, two things. One, I'll answer your question, then I have. So for me, it's when I was trying to talk about the sort of relation, because I think it depends on who the us is and who's positioned to see what and how. So I think yes, it's both historical, but it's both personal, deeply historical, and deeply present. Does that sort of get at your question? And then, if you're interested, since I was talking about it, it was a critique by Ken Johnson. And it was called it was his critique of Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, which is at MoMA PSI. So if you want to look it up at the Times, it was a scathing review, and many people wrote back in response to it.
So, do you mean personal and not personal in the sense that a viewer can choose not to be emotionally engaged with the work?
Yeah. I mean, I think that in some ways, because what she represents is almost so extreme that it becomes too hard to fully engage in it, and the kind of cartoonish nature of the caricatures that she uses allows an out if you don't want to fully engage in it.
Yeah, no, I think yeah, people it can allow a kind of out to say that, you know, this is too extreme, or that it's funny, right? So either way, it can allow some kind of emotional or response that isn't about sort of staying in the work that the work is trying to do. But I'll say that I didn't go see The Sugar Baby because I didn't want to experience that sort of multiplicity of gazes. I didn't think I could bear it. I knew I couldn't bear it. I knew better. And one of the benefits of getting older. You know what you cannot do.
Janie, do we need to wrap up?
Yeah.
Sounds like it.
So it's 5 minutes, 8 after.
Thank you all so very
Thank you.
much for coming.
Thank you.
This has been great.